I'm Alex. I do research and outreach at the OPTF, which is an Australian not-for-profit company working to defend people's digital rights. Today, I'm going to be talking about privacy scapegoats. So, what do I mean when I say privacy scapegoats? Well, in the tech industry and the wider tech landscape, I feel like there's this emerging dichotomy of privacy respecting companies versus privacy exploiting companies. But I want to dive into why I'm not really sure that this dichotomy is actually real as opposed to just being perceived, and why I kind of feel that way. I feel like a lot of the time we have companies like Meta and Google who get lambasted for very obvious reasons around their data privacy practices and just data collection overall. But in reality, they are part of a much larger, sprawling data economy that not only do they propagate and participate in, but so do those privacy respecting companies that are so keen to criticize them. So my prime example here is going to be Apple. So Apple is obviously the most valuable and biggest tech company by many measures in the entire world. And for a number of years now, they've been curating this reputation of being a privacy preserving company. They've tried to say, they've got a privacy positive philosophy, that privacy is a fundamental human right. And they've done this in a combination of ways. They've had a lot of advertising, like I saw billboards around my neighborhood that just said privacy, that's iPhone, and that was part of a bigger global campaign. They've also rolled out features, high-profile features, like the Ask app not to track and the privacy ratings in the App Store, as well as just commentary from leaders at the company like Tim Cook, and high-profile conflicts with law enforcement agencies such as the FBI over stuff like unlocking iPhones or being able to give access to iMessages, things like that. And generally, we've seen that consumers have really accepted this stance from Apple, and they have built this reputation as being a more private alternative to their competitors, like Android, which is obviously operated by Google, or Windows, which is operated by Microsoft. And it's not hard to see why consumers would feel like, these companies are less privacy preserving than Apple. Obviously, Apple's gone to great lengths to push that narrative out there. And on the other side of things, both Microsoft and Google have run into trouble with their data collection habits. But of course, things are not actually that simple. Apple and its products don't exist in a vacuum. And as I alluded to earlier, they and their company are part of a larger data economy, which pretty much every tech company that I could possibly think of is tangled up in some way or another. So Apple's privacy-centric approach is, in a lot of ways, enabled by revenue that they raise through partnerships with those more data-hungry companies that their leaders have been so keen to criticize. And, while a company like Google is openly and justifiably criticized by Apple and, the wider tech community, they do have a hand to play in Apple as well. So while speaking at a data protection conference back in 2018, Tim Cook categorized data hoarding companies and data hoarding practices as being surveillance. And this is something that we've seen a lot of commentators, make this comparison of data hoarding as being akin to surveillance and these personalized ads and the creepy feeling that you get. And he didn't name in this speech any of the companies like Google or Meta, but it was pretty clear that those were the companies that he was talking about when he was saying that, they take user data and weaponize it against us with military efficiency. Now, of course, it's not surprising that Tim Cook would come out and criticize a company like Google and their approach to data collection and privacy. First of all, of course, Google is a major competitor of Apple's with the iOS and Android mobile operating systems. And on top of that, Apple has very specifically and strategically chosen privacy to be a point of difference for them as a company and an advantage over a competitor such as Google. But in that speech, Tim Cook said that these stockpiles of personal data serve only to enrich the companies that collect them. And this should make us very uncomfortable, and it should unsettle us. Well, fast forward to 2021, and there were reports that Apple was netting a cool 15 billion US in return for making Google the default browser on iPhone devices. Now, this was expected to increase up to as much as 18 billion in 2022, and at the time, analysts believed that this was the biggest chunk of Apple's services arm revenue. Now, this is pretty significant in the context of Apple's shift towards services under the leadership of Tim Cook. Services have been responsible for the lion's share of revenue growth at Apple over the recent years. Now, this deal would seem to directly contradict what Tim Cook's statement was, that stockpiles of personal data only serve to enrich the companies collecting that data. A default search engine might seem like a relatively innocuous choice, but it clearly isn't. It's clearly worth at least $15 billion to Google. And it's really quite clear to see why. Privacy by default is a core tenet of creating privacy-preserving software. The underlying assumption is that the average user is very unlikely to alter the defaults on their device. So, if privacy is hidden behind a setting that needs to be changed, such as changing your default search engine to something like DuckDuckGo, most people will never do it. And of course, the tech companies like Google and Apple are very well aware of this, and so they're very aware of the choice that they're making when they allow Google to be the default search engine on an iPhone. That most iPhone users are going to end up using Google search engine and most likely just never changing it. And of course, just to complete that loop, so where does that $15 billion that lands in Apple's pocket come from? Well, data-driven advertising, of course, is the main source of revenue for Google in the second quarter of this year. 80% of Google's revenue came from advertising services. It's not shocking, but it is important to point out that the money that Apple receives is not only earned using data hoarding, but also propagates and enables continued or potentially even escalating levels of data collection. And coming back to Tim's comments back at that conference in 2018, it really does challenge the statement that these data hoarding practices only serve to benefit the companies who are doing them, because clearly that money is funneling back to a company like Apple, who is also benefiting from that revenue earned using data collection. Now, I don't want to call Apple out for being a hypocrite here. That's not quite the point that I'm trying to make. I do think that Apple has a pretty solid dedication to privacy, both as a principle and a philosophy for building technology. And I do believe that they are committed to trying to protect the privacy of Apple users, at least to some extent. But if the biggest tech company in the world is still raking in kickbacks from this, huge, bustling data economy, what hope do the rest of us have? Even foundations like Mozilla, which is a not-for-profit organization, face a similar dilemma. Back in 2020, they inked a similar deal with Alphabet to make Google the default search engine, valued somewhere between $400 and $450 million a year in a 3-year deal. Now, according to Mozilla's financial statements at the time, search engines paying to be the default provider accounted for about 90% of their funding. So, you could say that presumably Google is propping up Mozilla, one of the major competitors in the browser space. The question that we're left with is it really possible to be a privacy-preserving tech company in 2022? There's this huge data economy and industry and infrastructure which is pushing us towards collecting data towards feeding it back to companies like Google or Meta or whoever it may be. And can you escape that? There are a lot of companies and an increasing amount of companies as they realize that consumers truly do care about privacy and who do feel violated by the data collection practices of companies like Google. We're seeing more companies like DuckDuckGo, for example, as a search engine competitor, come and proclaim that their tech protects user privacy. Their companies have privacy positive policies, and making statements criticizing companies like Alphabet. But in the end, we're all completely dependent on their services, money, and platforms. We're still benefiting from the data that they collect and the data economy that exists around them. Now, I work for a team that builds Session, which is a private messaging app designed to capture almost no metadata about its users and maintain as much privacy as possible. And we've gone to great lengths to try and make Session as private as possible. It's built on top of a decentralized server infrastructure. It uses onion routing to obfuscate valuable personal identifying data like IP addresses. It doesn't require identifying information like a phone number or even an email to sign up, and just uses public-private key pairs for addressing. These are relatively extreme lengths, and to a lot of consumers, these are lengths they're not willing to even necessarily go to try and protect their privacy. But even us, even something as hardcore and extreme as Session, still has to rely on some of these big data hoarding platforms or companies for something like user acquisition. How do you acquire users without using social media, without using Google ads or Meta ads? How do you acquire users without publishing your app to the Play Store or the App Store? Is it really possible at all? Well, probably not. We always rely on these platforms in some way, and by doing so, we're feeding more and more data into the machine. So in the end, the question, and this is a question that I don't really have the answer for right now, is how do we escape this cycle? How do we move on and create a new internet or a new tech economy that doesn't rely on data as the fuel to keep on going? Is there a less exploitative model that still relies on data that we can use instead? Because at the moment, everybody is very caught up and entangled in this data economy, which has been propped up by companies like Alphabet and Meta, and it doesn't seem like there's an easy way out. So whoever is able to come up with this solution, and we've seen some companies like Brave propose that we need, a seismic shift away from, data which is ultimately used to serve personalized ads, and they've had a different model that they've come up with using their basic attention token. And in the meantime, while of course we should criticize companies like Alphabet for potentially having exploitative data collection practices, I think it's also important to keep it in context, and also important not to necessarily pat people on the back too much, who in the end are still using and benefiting and relying on those Alphabet services, just for example. And that's sort of what I'm getting at, in the sense that we can't just heap all of the blame on Alphabet and say, wow, you're doing such horrible, horrible things when it comes to data collection and data hoarding and exploitation of user data, but then look at the wider tech landscape and all of the companies that are using those platforms, that are benefiting from them as well. And how much responsibility do they have? So that's pretty much everything from me today. Thanks for listening to my chat about privacy scapegoats. I hope you enjoy the rest of the forum, and feel free to get in touch with me if you would like to chat with me about this talk or about Session or the work I do with the OPTF, or if you just want to have a yarn, feel free to get in touch. Thanks, everybody.